Hey everyone! Before this story begins, take a second to breathe because this is not just another revenge story. This is a rise from the ashes testimony. If you believe in silent strength, delayed justice, and the kind of glow-up that makes the past choke on its own words, then stay with me. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and welcome to Black Queen Dominion, where forgotten daughters become unstoppable women. This story begins the way many quiet betrayals do, not with cruelty screamed out loud, but with indifference disguised as parenting. I grew up in a house where survival was praised more than dreams, where bills were discussed louder than futures, where love was present but always measured, always conditional, always tied to convenience. Education was something my parents respected in theory, but never invested in emotionally. They spoke of college like it was a luxury cruise for spoiled children, not a ladder out of generational struggle. When report cards came home with high marks, they nodded. When acceptance letters arrived, they stiffened. And when tuition numbers appeared, their pride disappeared. By the time I was 17, I had already learned that being intelligent did not mean being supported. I had learned that being capable did not guarantee being chosen. I had learned that some parents love their children deeply but not equally and not at equal cost. When the subject of college finally became unavoidable, the response was swift and cold. My future was declared my responsibility. My dreams were labeled my burden. My ambition was framed as inconvenience. They did not yell. They did not argue. They simply withdrew as if disengaging from a bill they never intended to pay. In that moment, something in me hardened. Not with anger but with clarity. I realized that I was standing at the edge of my life alone, and no one was coming to build the bridge for me. I could either step back into the comfort of lowered expectations or walk forward into debt, struggle, and uncertainty. I chose forward. The months that followed were brutal. I balanced late nights studying with early morning shifts. I learned the taste of exhaustion and the weight of isolation. I watched peers celebrate family support while I celebrated small victories like buying used textbooks and stretching meals across days. My parents watched quietly. They did not ask how I managed. They did not check in. They did not attend campus events. They treated my education like a personal experiment they had opted out of funding. If I failed, it would confirm their doubts. If I succeeded, it would be mine alone. What hurt the most was not the lack of money. It was the lack of belief. The silent message that said if I could not afford my dreams, I did not deserve them. But struggle does something powerful when it meets determination. It sharpens focus. It removes distractions. It forces growth. I stopped asking for validation and started building proof. I studied harder. I networked quietly. I worked jobs that paid little but taught me discipline, resilience, and emotional independence. Every semester completed felt like a private rebellion. Every past exam felt like a quiet declaration. I was becoming someone they did not recognize, and that terrified them more than failure ever could. By the time graduation approached, I was not just educated. I was transformed. I had learned how to survive without approval, how to succeed without applause, how to stand firm when love came with conditions. And that was only the beginning. Because the moment money entered my life, everything changed. And the people who said college was my problem suddenly remembered they were my parents. Success does not arrive politely. It does not knock softly or ask permission to exist. It enters boldly, rearranging everything, exposing everyone, and forcing people to confront who they were when you had nothing. After graduation, the world did not immediately open its doors. There were rejections. There were interviews that went nowhere. There were moments of doubt where exhaustion whispered that maybe my parents had been right. But quitting had never been an option. Not after everything I had survived. The opportunity came quietly, wrapped in long hours and underestimated potential. A position others had overlooked. A company others had dismissed. I saw it differently. I poured myself into it not because it was glamorous but because it was mine. Months passed. Then a year. My work ethic turned heads. My consistency built trust. My silence became strategy. Promotions followed. Raises stacked. And one day, without ceremony or announcement, I crossed a financial line I had never seen before. I had money. Not reckless money. Not flashy money. But stable, undeniable independence money. The kind that pays bills early. The kind that builds savings. The kind that changes posture, tone, and treatment. And suddenly my parents noticed. The calls started coming more often. Not to ask how I was, but to ask what I was doing. Their curiosity was masked as concern. Their interest dressed up as pride. They spoke my achievements out loud now, repeating them to others as if they had sponsored the journey. They had not paid for a single credit. Not supported a single semester. Not attended a single milestone. But now they wanted proximity to the success they once dismissed. I watched the shift with quiet observation. I saw how my value increased the moment my income did. How respect arrived once struggle left. How support appeared only after proof was delivered. It was a painful lesson but a necessary one. The requests began subtly. Small favors. Temporary help. Gentle suggestions. The same people who once told me to figure it out were now comfortable leaning on what I had built alone. And I felt the weight of a choice approaching. Because forgiveness is easy when it costs nothing. But grace becomes complicated when it demands self-betrayal. I had worked too hard to be pulled back into dynamics that only valued me when I was useful. I was no longer the child begging for belief. I was the woman holding boundaries. And they did not like that. The tension grew. Expectations rose. Entitlement crept in. And I realized something that changed everything. They did not regret not helping me. They regretted missing out on the returns. And that realization marked the moment when my silence turned into strategy. Because the story was no longer about college. It was about power. By the time my financial stability became undeniable, the atmosphere around me shifted completely. The same home that once treated my ambition like an inconvenience now treated my presence like an opportunity. I could feel it in the pauses, the calculated warmth, the way my name was suddenly spoken with pride in rooms I was not even in. Guilt arrived quietly, dressed as concern. It showed up in reminders of sacrifices they claimed to have made. In stories about how hard parenting had been. In subtle references to age, stress, and responsibility. They did not apologize for the past. They rewrote it. In their version, they had never refused support. They had simply prepared me for reality. But reality remembered differently. I remembered the nights of panic over tuition deadlines. The humiliation of asking strangers for help because my own family would not. The emotional distance that taught me to survive without comfort. None of that disappeared just because my bank account grew. So they pressed closer. Expectations were no longer whispered. They were implied. If I truly loved them, I would help. If I was truly grateful, I would give back. If I was truly successful, I would share the reward. What they never acknowledged was that success had come at a cost they were unwilling to pay. I felt the familiar pressure of being the strong one, the responsible one, the capable one. The child who figured things out. The daughter who didn't need help. The same label that once justified neglect was now being used to justify entitlement. And for a moment I almost gave in. Not because I owed them, but because I had been conditioned to feel responsible for other people's comfort at the expense of my own. Years of emotional independence had not erased that reflex. It had only buried it under discipline. But growth has a way of resurfacing truth. I began to recognize the pattern clearly. When I struggled, I was alone. When I succeeded, I was expected to share. Their support was retroactive, conditional, and transactional. It came with expectations, not accountability. And that was when I understood something powerful. They were not asking for help. They were asking for access. Access to my stability. Access to my peace. Access to the version of me they had not invested in but now wanted to benefit from. So I slowed down. I stopped over-explaining. I stopped justifying my boundaries. I stopped shrinking my discomfort to keep them comfortable. I realized that adulthood was not just about paying bills or earning degrees. It was about deciding who deserved a seat at the table I built. The more I resisted, the more uncomfortable they became. Boundaries exposed what entitlement tries to hide. And they did not like the mirror I was holding up. They reminded me that family helps family. They reminded me of tradition. Of obligation. Of blood. But blood had not paid my tuition. Tradition had not stayed up late with me when fear kept me awake. Obligation had not filled out scholarship forms or worked double shifts. I had done that. Alone. And the more I stood firm, the clearer it became that their disappointment was not rooted in hurt, but in loss of control. They were no longer the authority. They were no longer the gatekeepers of my future. I was. That shift unsettled them. Because the daughter they once dismissed had become the woman they now needed. And need, when paired with pride, often turns into resentment. I felt it in the tension. In the passive remarks. In the sudden emotional distance. Their warmth cooled when my compliance didn't follow. Their pride dimmed when they realized success had not made me submissive. And that was the turning point. I understood that no amount of money would ever heal what accountability refused to address. That financial generosity without emotional reckoning would only reinforce the very dynamics that once broke me. So I chose differently. I chose self-respect over guilt. Boundaries over approval. Long-term peace over short-term appeasement. And in doing so, I unknowingly set the stage for the moment they would finally reveal who they were when denied access to what they felt entitled to. Because rejection feels different when the power has shifted. And they were about to feel it. Power shifts rarely happen quietly. They create friction. They expose cracks. They force people to react instead of perform. And when my parents realized that guilt was no longer working, their true feelings rose to the surface. The warmth disappeared completely. What replaced it was irritation disguised as disappointment. A subtle hostility wrapped in concern. They no longer pretended to celebrate my independence. They questioned it. They framed my boundaries as arrogance. My self-respect as selfishness. My refusal to give as betrayal. I watched it all with a clarity I had never had before. They spoke of family values while ignoring family history. They emphasized loyalty while forgetting abandonment. They demanded gratitude without accountability. It was no longer about help. It was about control slipping through their fingers. The dynamic had changed and they could not adjust. I noticed how quickly admiration turned into criticism once I stopped being useful. How pride transformed into resentment when access was denied. How love became conditional the moment it was no longer rewarded. They began rewriting the narrative publicly. In their version of the story, I had changed. Success had made me cold. Money had made me distant. Independence had made me disrespectful. They painted themselves as victims of a daughter who forgot where she came from. What they never mentioned was where they left me. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I had learned that people committed to misunderstanding you will twist any explanation into confirmation of their bias. Silence, I realized, was not weakness. It was restraint. And restraint terrified them. Because silence meant I was no longer asking. No longer explaining. No longer seeking approval. I was simply living, unbothered, unmoved, and unaffected by their disappointment. That was unacceptable to them. The pressure escalated. Expectations were stated openly now. They no longer danced around what they wanted. They spoke as if my success belonged to the family. As if my income was a shared asset. As if my hard work automatically converted into obligation. They did not ask how it felt to be unsupported. They asked what I was willing to give. That moment clarified everything. I saw that their love had always been tied to usefulness. That my value had been measured not by who I was, but by what I could provide. When I had nothing, I was invisible. When I had something, I was expected to distribute it. And that was the moment I stopped feeling guilty. Because guilt only survives where doubt exists. And I no longer doubted myself. I had earned every dollar. Every opportunity. Every ounce of peace. I had paid for my education not just with money, but with loneliness, exhaustion, and emotional sacrifice. No one had carried me. No one had lifted the weight. No one had softened the fall. I had become strong because I had no other choice. And strength, once developed, does not disappear to make others comfortable. Their disappointment no longer felt personal. It felt predictable. People who benefit from your lack of boundaries will always resent their presence. And they resented mine deeply. So I stopped engaging entirely. I limited access. I reduced communication. I stopped sharing details about my life. I protected my peace with the same intensity one once protected my dreams. And that was when the accusations peaked. They called me ungrateful. They implied abandonment. They suggested I was punishing them. They framed my boundaries as revenge. But this was not revenge. This was consequence. Consequence for absence. Consequence for dismissal. Consequence for love that showed up only after success. And still I did not retaliate. I let them sit with their discomfort. I let them feel the distance they had created years ago. I let them experience the silence they once handed me so easily. It was not cruelty. It was balance. And somewhere in that quiet separation, I felt something new settle into my spirit. Freedom. Freedom from needing their approval. Freedom from explaining my worth. Freedom from carrying guilt that was never mine to hold. I was no longer the daughter trying to prove she deserved support. I was the woman who had proven she never needed it. And that realization prepared me for the final shift. Because when people realize they have truly lost control, they either accept it or expose themselves completely. And my parents were about to do the latter. By the time the distance settled into permanence, something remarkable had happened inside me. The ache I once carried had dissolved. The longing for acknowledgement had faded. The need for validation had disappeared entirely. In its place stood something solid, grounded, and unshakable. Acceptance. Not of their behavior but of reality. I accepted that my parents would never apologize in the way I once hoped. I accepted that they would never fully admit the harm caused by their absence. I accepted that their version of love was limited by pride, fear, and control. And in that acceptance I found peace. The final shift came quietly. There was no dramatic confrontation. No explosive argument. No emotional closure scene. Life simply continued forward without their influence. Milestones passed without announcements. Success expanded without permission. My world grew while their access remained limited. And they noticed. For the first time, they realized that money was no longer the center of the conversation. Influence was. Presence was. Power was. They were no longer essential to my life. They were optional. That truth humbled them in ways words never could. I saw it in the way their energy softened. In how demands turned into hesitations. In how entitlement gave way to uncertainty. They had finally understood something they never expected. I was not withholding to punish them. I was protecting myself. And protection is not cruelty. It is wisdom learned the hard way. I did not cut them off with bitterness. I did not use my success to embarrass them. I did not weaponize my independence. I simply stopped chasing a version of family that only existed when it was convenient. I chose myself. I chose stability over chaos. Peace over performance. Respect over obligation. I chose to honor the version of me who survived alone, who studied through tears, who worked through exhaustion, who believed in herself when no one else did. That version deserved safety. The irony was undeniable. They said college was my problem. And they were right. Because solving it made me powerful. Taught me discipline. Taught me boundaries. It taught me self-worth. It taught me that support delayed until success is not support at all. It is opportunism. The very thing they refused to invest in became the reason I no longer needed permission. And that is the lesson. Not every door closes to hurt you. Some close to force you to build your own entrance. Not every rejection is a loss. Some are redirection into greatness. Not every absence is abandonment. Some are invitations to rise alone. I did not win because I had money. I won because I learned who I was without it. I learned that I could survive disappointment. That I could thrive without approval. That I could love without sacrificing myself. That I could stand firm even when misunderstood. That is what made me dangerous. Not in a loud way, but in a way that could never be controlled again. So to every listener who has ever been told their dreams were their problem, remember this. Sometimes, the lack of support is the very thing that sharpens you into something unstoppable. And when the people who doubted you finally come back, they won't be looking for reconciliation. They'll be looking for access. Choose wisely. Because queens do not explain their boundaries. They enforce them. And this is what happens when a black queen rises, claims her power, and refuses to hand it back to anyone who didn't help her build it.